Well, efforts by the opposition to hold committee hearings into the accusations of government interference in the prosecution of Vice-Admiral Mark Norman hit a dead end today. The Liberal majority on the Commons Defence Committee shot down a motion to hold public hearings that would have included the former second-in-command of the Canadian Forces and the Prime Minister. The opposition parties argued there are lots of questions that need to be answered. The government side accused the opposition of playing politics. A single charge of breach of trust against Norman was stayed after the Crown was provided with new evidence by the defence team. The whole process has raised questions about why Norman was pursued for allegedly leaking cabinet secrets, questions about the role of the government and the role of the RCMP. Let's bring in three members of Parliament now to follow up on the committee hearing today. Steve McKinnon is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. James Bezan is the Defence Critic for the Official Opposition, and Randall Garrison is the Defence Critic for the NDP. Both Mr. Bezan and Mr. Garrison are members of the Standing Committee on Defence. Mr. McKinnon, let me start with you. You were in the meeting for part of it today. Why did Liberals on that committee vote down these hearings to investigate what happened to Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, and why?
Well, we consider this matter closed, as does the defense for Mr. Norman, as does the prosecution. The professionals that were involved in this, where it should be, in independent procedures, independent processes, have all concluded their work and have determined not to proceed any further. At the end of the day, independent agencies and the justice system generally worked, it functioned, and the outcome is what it is. The inference that there has been some sort of political overlay to this has really yielded only dry holes in terms of the opposition.
Mr. Norman has said that he has more to tell. He has a story he thinks Canadians should hear. Do you believe he has a story to tell and should be allowed to tell it?
Well, I have no idea what his story might be, but I also have no doubt that in a free and democratic society, he's able to tell his story.
Not that free, though. If he goes back to work, there's really only one place he can say it without being subject to punishment, and that's the Defence Committee. Listen,
if you're an employee of the Canadian Armed Forces, you of course live under the strictures of the Canadian Armed Forces. I think any man or woman in uniform would accept that, and they sign up for that quite willingly.
All right, Mr. Bezan, what do you think of what happened today?
Well, it's incredibly disappointing to see the Liberals shut down committee on this, that they're doing their cover-up. You know, Vice-Admiral Mark Norman served this country for, I think it's 38 years, and they won't even give him 38 seconds at our Defence Committee. He said he has a story to tell. We had two different opportunities to vote today to allow him to appear. First as a larger group of witnesses, right, and then just having Vice-Admiral Norman appear on his own.
Yeah. And that was Mr. Garrison's amendment. I'll get to that in a moment.
And both times the Liberals said no. And then we get a lot of Liberal doublespeak saying, yeah, we want to hear what he has to say, but this isn't the forum to do it. Well, I can tell you that there's only two places in Canada where you can appear and you can have the freedom to speak and be, they're under, in our case, parliamentary privilege. And yet, so they're saying no to appearing within the parliamentary construct that we have here with our National Defence Committee. Essentially, they're saying pretty much he has to go back to the courts to get his story out. And we all know that he's innocent, that all charges against him have been dropped, and the Liberals are now trying to cover it all up.
They've been stayed, though, just as a legal nicety. They've been stayed, not dropped.
The judge at the end of it all said, you're free to go, okay. You're a free man.
Mr. Garrison, you had proposed, you were trying to sort of make something palatable for everybody here, and that would be to just have Mr. Norman and not the whole list of other, that's right, somebody could argue political witnesses show up. You wanted to hear just from, what was the point you were trying to make or the purpose you were trying to achieve here?
Well, the reason I signed the original letter for the meeting was my concern that Vice-Admiral Norman, who has suffered through this enormously damaging process for such a very long time, get the chance to tell his story in a place where he couldn't be sued or otherwise legally pursued for what he had to say. So the only place that can take place is in a parliamentary committee. And so, yes, I agree we should hear from more people as a committee. We'd like to have the whole story, but it was clear the government wasn't interested in hearing from the other witnesses.
And you could always do that after hearing from Mr. Norman. You could always make that case.
As I said in the committee, yeah. If we heard things from Vice-Admiral Norman that required further investigation, the committee is, according to the government, master of its own fate, and we could have done that. So my compromise here was to try and get people together, simply to give Vice-Admiral Norman the chance to defend his career, defend his reputation, defend the work that he's done for Canada, and explain what actually happened from his point of view.
Do any of you know whether Mark Norman wants to come to the committee?
This is an interesting comment because, you know, it was suggested by one of the Liberal members that if Vice-Admiral Norman wanted to appear, he could write to us and we'd let him appear. Well, you got to remember that first and foremost, he's still in uniform. So he's bound by the Queen's regulations and orders, and he wouldn't be allowed to insert himself that way because it might be considered politically driven. He has to be nonpartisan. He is in service to Canada and to the government of Canada, and I probably wouldn't be allowed as long as he's wearing his uniform. So he would have to wait till he actually retires before he'd be in a position to write to committee and say he would like to participate.
Okay. What about that, Mr. McKinnon? I mean, that seemed to be one of the ideas. Well, he can write to the committee if he wants to appear, but he can't really do that, can he? To your point, if he continues to serve in uniform, what other forum is there where if Mark Norman has a story to tell, and maybe it's a story that that Canadians should hear, and I don't know that, and maybe you don't know that, where else can he do it?
Well, I don't know what Mark Norman might or might not have to say, and I'm sure when he chooses, if he chooses to speak his mind, then I'm sure we'll all be all ears. Though I think the important thing today, and the important thing all of this week, is that very simply put, whether you ask the defense, Mr. Norman's legal team, whether you ask the Public Prosecution Service of Canada or anyone else involved in this, there was absolutely no political interference.
Wrong.
Any attempt to apply a political overlay to this has really yielded nothing of any kind of substance. Most commentators right throughout the week have come to that exact same conclusion. I know Canadians have come to that conclusion. And this thing, while it arrived at a somewhat halting end, ended as it began, in the hands of an independent police force and an independent prosecution service, and all of that is, of course, backed up with the testimony and the words of the defense counsel for Vice-Admiral Norman himself, who said there was absolutely no interference from anyone other than those who are appropriate.
It's really nice that Steve likes to take things out of context, because what she said is that in the discharge and of the breach,
in the laying of charges and staying of charges.
And staying of charges. Everything in between, including, according to the judge, that there was political interference directly on the Public Prosecution Service through the PCO. Of course, who was the head of the PCO at the time? It was Michael Warnick. You know, we still go back to that before charges were even laid. We had Prime Minister Trudeau on 2 different occasions talking about Mark Norman being charged. So, you know, this whole process still stinks of political interference. We can never forget that, and that's why we need to have this investigation, to ensure that Canadians know that our judicial system has survived and being independent despite attempts by the Liberal government and Prime Minister Trudeau to really set up a 2-tiered system, one for Justin Trudeau and his friends, and another one for people like Mark Norman.
Mr. Garrison, where do you think? Hang on, Mr. McKinnon. I'll come back. Mr. Garrison, Mr. Garrison, where do
with a little bit?
What are we left with now, Mr. Garrison?
With a little bit of time, I've had to reflect on this. I think what bothers me the most is that through this whole Mark Norman affair, I hate that it's called that, but there's been an attempt to put the onus on him. And what we actually did in committee by deciding not to hear him is put the onus back on him again and say it's up to him to come forward. It's up to him to do things. When the members should be well enough informed to know that he can't do that as a serving Canadian Armed Forces member.
Right, it gets kind of technical. Like if you, I mean, okay, so if he stays in, if he's back at his job or some job and he's still in uniform, stays there, and you invite him.
The House of Commons and its committees can invite or summon anyone they choose to the committee. And
so that would absolve him of the Queen's rules, correct?
There would be no repercussions for him appearing under an invitation from the committee. Right. The opposite of that is not true. And so once again, we've made sort of Vice-Admiral Norman the butt of things here, and saying, you know, if he's not talking, it's his fault.
So
well, that's not exactly true.
Mr. McKinnon, if there's nothing to see here, why not invite him? And if he comes and has nothing to say, everybody wins, right?
What you're witnessing here, Peter, is really just a desperate opposition in the dying days of this Parliament, trying to apply a political overlay in some sort of hunt that's based on things that have been conjured up in their own minds. None of it's supported by fact. None of it is supported by independent officials. None of it is supported at any level by anyone involved in the process.
Then why not invite him to the committee?
There's a mounting.
No, then why not invite him to the committee and have him?
Exactly the opposite.
Hang on, just let me ask the last question. Why not invite him to committee and have him say, there's nothing here? I'm at committee to tell you it's exactly as it's been presented, that there was no interference. I just didn't like the way I was treated, and I want some compensation, or I want something else, but there was no political. Why not invite him and see what he says?
Nothing prevents Vice-Admiral Norman from, at the appropriate time and the appropriate place, from speaking his mind. We live in a free and democratic society.
Well, he'd have to retire from his job, wouldn't he?
Well, again, you
going to die in justice until he retires. The liberal way.
You sign up to live under the
Die in
restrictions of the
justice,
Canadian
the liberal
Armed
way.
Forces.
And I signed very quickly. I signed up to stick to the clock, Mr. Garrison. Go ahead.
Well, can I just say here that for me, it's not about politics. It's about a man who served this country with honor and distinction, whose reputation and career have been damaged. And my goal today was to give him an opportunity to tell his side of that story, and I remain profoundly disappointed that that's not going to happen.
All right, thank you all, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Take care.